Welcome to our deep dive on renting in Chile. We're going to be exploring the ins and outs of the Chilean rental market based on that super insightful YouTube video you sent over. Get ready to unlock the secrets of contracts, tenant and landlord rights, and who knows, maybe even pick up some insider tips from those who already braved the Chilean rental scene.
I think it's a fantastic topic. Understanding the rental landscape in another country can be so valuable, whether you're thinking about moving, investing, or just expanding your knowledge horizons.
For sure. The video really jumps right in by highlighting those contratos de arrendamientos. These are the rental agreements that pretty much lay down the law for renting in Chile. They emphasize how important these contracts are. It's like a rule book for both the landlord, the arrendador, and the tenant, the arrendatario.
Yeah, and what I find really interesting is how they focus on clarity and security for both sides.
Yeah.
It's not just like handing over cash for keys. It's more like this meticulous process of creating a legally binding agreement that lays out everyone's responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about setting the stage for a smooth and transparent rental experience,
Yeah, totally. It's like they're setting the tone for the whole renting process in Chile. And then the video goes on to explain that there's not just one type of rental contract in Chile, which is something you might not expect. There are fixed-term contracts, which can be anywhere from 1 to 5 years. And then there's indefinite-term contracts, which are a bit more flexible, and even commercial contracts specifically for businesses.
And that's where Chilean law gets really interesting. There's actually a mandatory minimum contract duration of 5 years. You can have shorter agreements with options to renew, of course. But that 5-year rule brings a level of stability for tenants that's pretty remarkable.
Wow, I can imagine the peace of mind knowing you have 5 years guaranteed in your rental. It really makes you wonder how that affects the dynamics between landlords and tenants.
Yeah, it can be a double-edged sword. While that long-term security is great for tenants, it can also backfire a bit. If a tenant needs to move sooner than expected, maybe because of work or personal reasons, they might have to pay penalties for breaking the contract. And from the landlord side, it could mean being tied to a tenant for a longer period, even if things aren't going smoothly. It's an interesting example of how a law that's meant to provide stability can also create unexpected complexities.
That's a great point. It makes you really appreciate the nuances of these regulations. The video also dives into the specific rights and obligations of both landlords and tenants. It's almost like a checklist to ensure a fair and balanced rental environment. What are some of the key takeaways for someone who's thinking about renting in Chile?
Well, the video highlights some really important points. For a tenant, understanding your right to a habitable and well-maintained property is crucial. This means things like working plumbing, electricity, and essential appliances. On the other side, as a tenant, you'll also have responsibilities like paying rent on time, keeping the property in good condition, and respecting the terms of the contract. It's all about creating a balanced and mutually beneficial relationship.
Sounds like Chilean law really emphasizes a sense of shared responsibility between landlords and tenants.
Absolutely. And this is really clear when they talk about ending a lease, which the video also covers. Tenants need to give 30 days notice after the first 6 months, while landlords have to give a 2-month notice. This focus on clear communication and reasonable notice periods is another way Chilean law protects both parties and avoids sudden disruptions.
So it's not just about signing on the dotted line. It's about understanding the entire life cycle of the agreement. Now there's also the fianza, which is like a security deposit, usually equal to 1 month's rent. The video makes a point of saying you shouldn't hand this over before signing the contract, which seems like solid advice to avoid scams.
Yeah, that's a really important point. The fianza is standard practice in Chile, and it's meant to cover potential damages or breaches of contract. But you want to make sure all the paperwork is in order and that the contract clearly outlines the terms of the deposit before you give anyone any money.
Trust but verify.
Right, exactly. And this theme of transparency and being cautious continues as the video wraps up. They give some practical advice for both tenants and landlords, urging both sides to carefully review the contract, maintain open communication, and report any damages right away.
I love that they bring in this practical angle. It's like getting insider tips from someone who's been there, done that. What stands out to you as particularly important advice for someone navigating the Chilean rental scene?
The emphasis on documentation is a key takeaway for both tenants and landlords. Imagine you're about to move into this new apartment in Chile. They recommend making a detailed inventory of the property's condition, noting any damage or wear and tear. This simple step can prevent so many headaches later on, especially when it comes to getting your fianza back. For landlords, keeping good records of rent payments, maintenance requests, and communication with tenants is super important.
So it's all about being organized and proactive, which can make all the difference.
Exactly. And it's not just about avoiding disputes, it's also about building a good landlord-tenant relationship based on respect, clear expectations, and open communication. That's what makes renting a good experience no matter where you are.
Totally agree. Those tips go beyond just Chile and get at the core principles of a good rental agreement.
Absolutely. Now that we've covered the basics of contracts, rights, and responsibilities, I think it's time to dive into the specifics of how these rental agreements are actually formalized in Chile. There are some pretty unique procedures and documents that are super important in making everything official and legally binding.
Okay, let's unpack that. The video mentions the Referencia Catastral de la Vivienda, which sounds a bit technical. What is it and why is it so important?
It's basically like a property ID, like a fingerprint for the rental unit. It ensures that the property is properly identified and registered in Chile. This attention to detail shows how important transparency and accuracy are in the Chilean rental system. It minimizes the risk of fraud or disputes about property ownership. As a tenant, it's reassuring to know that the property you're renting is legitimate and properly documented.
It's an extra layer of protection and assurance?
Exactly. It adds to the overall sense of security and transparency that seems to be a big part of the Chilean rental system.
The video also talks about gathering personal information like your ID contact details and bank account information. This is pretty standard for any rental agreement, right?
Yeah, it's common practice globally. Landlords need this information for identification, communication, and to process rent payments. But the video emphasizes something that people often overlook. You have to review every single detail of the contract before signing.
Golden rule no matter where you're renting.
Absolutely. It's so easy to just skim through legal documents, but taking the time to understand what you're agreeing to can save you from a lot of trouble. If anything's unclear, don't be afraid to ask for clarification. Remember, this is a legally binding agreement, so you need to feel confident and comfortable with everything before you sign.
Speaking of feeling confident and comfortable, the video highlights some great tips for both tenants and landlords tailored to the Chilean rental scene. Let's get into those next.
Sounds good. I'm ready when you are.
Perfect. Let's dive in. All right, so we've talked about a lot already. Contracts, those legal details, the property ID thing, and of course, reading the contract carefully. But the video also has some really practical tips for renters and landlords in Chile.
Yeah, and these tips, they really show how important it is to be proactive and to communicate well when you're renting.
Okay, let's break it down. What are some of the main things renters should keep in mind?
Well, the video emphasizes a few key points for anyone thinking about renting in Chile. First of all, read that contract. Don't just glance at it. Make sure you understand every single clause, every little detail. Don't hesitate to ask if anything's unclear.
It seems like being informed and proactive is really key here.
Absolutely. Knowing what you're getting into is super important, especially with legal agreements. The video also talks about taking care of the property, treating it with respect and keeping it in good condition. Not only does that make your living space more comfortable, but it also helps prevent issues with the landlord later on.
Makes sense. And of course, paying rent on time is a given, right?
Right. Timely rent payments are essential. They show that you're committed to the agreement and help build a positive relationship with your landlord. And lastly, the video stresses the importance of reporting any damage to the property right away. It shows you're responsible, and it helps get things fixed before they become bigger problems.
So basically, be a good tenant. Take care of the place like it's your own.
Exactly. And when you do that, it benefits you as a renter, but it also makes the whole experience smoother and more harmonious for everyone involved.
What about landlords? What advice does the video have for them?
For landlords in Chile, they emphasize keeping really good records. This means documenting everything, rent payments, maintenance requests, any communication with tenants. Having everything written down not only keeps you organized, but it can also be really helpful if any disputes or misunderstandings come up.
It's like laying the groundwork for a transparent and accountable relationship.
Precisely. And beyond that, they talk about being proactive with maintenance. Fixing things promptly and keeping the property in good shape is good for the tenant, and it also protects your investment.
It's about being a responsible property owner, providing a comfortable and well-maintained space for people to live in.
Exactly. And they also emphasize being responsive to tenants' needs. Listening to them, addressing their requests quickly, and fostering open communication can go a long way in building a good relationship.
It sounds like these tips, even though they're specific to Chile, could apply to renting almost anywhere. It's about setting clear expectations, communicating openly, and respecting each other's roles in the agreement.
I completely agree. Those principles are universal. They're the foundation of a successful and harmonious rental experience, no matter where you are. Now, while we've been focusing on these practical tips, I think it's worth going back to the fianza, that security deposit we talked about. The video mentions some specific rules about what happens to it when the lease is over, and that's where things can get a bit tricky.
Okay, let's dig into that. The video doesn't go into a ton of detail, but it does say that the purpose of the fianza is to cover damages beyond normal wear and tear.
Right, and that's where disagreements can happen. What one person sees as normal wear and tear, someone else might think is damage that needs to be fixed.
So let's say there's a stain on the carpet or a scratch on the counter. Who decides if that's the tenant's fault or just normal from living in the space?
That's a great question. And there's no easy answer. It often comes down to negotiation and how you interpret the contract. That's why it's so important to have that detailed inventory of the property's condition when you start renting. It gives you a clear point of reference at the end and can help prevent these kinds of arguments.
That makes sense. So what happens if there's a disagreement? Do you have to go to court in Chile?
Going to court is always a last resort. It can take a long time and cost a lot of money. Luckily, Chile has other ways to handle rental disputes that are often more efficient and less confrontational.
Oh, good. What are some of those options?
One option is mediation. A neutral third party helps the landlord and tenant find a solution they both agree on. It's usually faster, cheaper, and less stressful than going to court.
That sounds much better. So mediation is one possibility. What if that doesn't work out?
Then the next step is usually arbitration. It's more formal. An arbitrator who's an expert in rental law hears both sides of the story and makes a decision that everyone has to follow.
So it's kind of like a mini court case, but hopefully quicker and less expensive.
Exactly. And since the arbitrator is an expert, their decision carries more weight than just a casual agreement.
It's good to know that Chile has these alternative options for resolving disputes. It makes renting there seem less intimidating knowing that there are fair ways to handle disagreements.
I agree. It shows that the system tries to be balanced and protect both landlords and tenants if problems come up. It's all about finding a middle ground where everyone's rights are protected. But the whole process is as smooth and conflict-free as possible.
We've been talking a lot about this specific YouTube video on renting in Chile, but I'm curious about your broader experience with renting in other countries. What are some of the most common misconceptions or surprises people run into?
That's a great question. One common misconception is thinking that renting is the same everywhere, that what works in one country will work in another. We've already seen that Chile has some unique laws, like that 5-year minimum contract.
Right, those little differences can really catch people off guard.
Absolutely. It's not just the laws themselves. It's also the cultural norms around renting those can vary a lot from one place to another and affect everything from how people communicate to how formal the landlord-tenant relationship is.
Can you give some examples of those cultural differences?
Sure. In some cultures, it's normal for landlords and tenants to be quite close, almost like family. They might visit each other often and even share meals. But in other cultures, it's much more formal and distant. People communicate mostly through official channels. Understanding those nuances can make a big difference in having a good rental experience and avoiding misunderstandings.
So it's not just about knowing the laws, it's also about being sensitive to the culture. What other surprises might people encounter when they're renting in a new country?
Another common one is the amount of bureaucracy in some countries. You might have to get special permits, go through background checks, or provide a ton of documents that you wouldn't need back home.
Paperwork, the international language of bureaucracy.
Exactly. And if you don't speak the language well, that can be a big challenge too. It's crucial to have someone you trust who can help you with the documents and talk to landlords or agents.
It sounds like doing your research and getting advice from local experts, whether it's an agent, a lawyer, or a friend who knows the area, is really important.
Absolutely. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Make sure you understand everything and stand up for yourself. Remember, you're signing a legal agreement, so you need to feel good about every part of the process.
This has been incredibly helpful. We've gone from the specifics of renting in Chile to bigger ideas about renting anywhere in the world. It's interesting how something as everyday as renting can teach you so much about different cultures and legal systems.
It's a good reminder that even ordinary things can be full of surprises and learning experiences if you approach them with curiosity and an open mind.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up our deep dive into Chilean rentals, let's go back to those practical tips from the video. It's worth emphasizing them again for our listeners.
You're right. For tenants, the key takeaways are reviewing the contract, thoroughly paying rent on time, taking good care of the property, and communicating clearly with the landlord.
And for landlords, it's all about documentation, proactive maintenance, and being responsive to tenants' concerns. It's like a recipe for a good and successful relationship.
Exactly. And while the specific details might be different in other countries, the main principles respect transparency, open communication, Those are universal. They're the foundation for a positive experience for both sides, no matter where you're renting.
Now, even though we've covered a lot today, contracts, fianzas, cultural differences, how to handle disputes, there's one last thought I want to leave our listeners with. We talked about how important it is to understand local laws and customs when you're renting abroad. But what about the emotional side of things? How do you create a sense of home when you're living in a temporary space in a different country?
That's a really deep question and one that deserves some thought. It's about finding ways to make the space your own, connecting with the community, and embracing the unique things about your temporary home.
It's about turning a house or an apartment into a place where you feel comfortable and at ease, even if it's not where you'll be forever.
Exactly. It's about creating a haven, a sanctuary, a place that reflects who you are and where you feel good.
Yeah.
And it's also about going beyond the walls of your rental, getting to know the people and the culture around you, and maybe even making new connections that enrich your experience.
That's beautifully said. And with that thought-provoking note, we'll say goodbye to our listeners for now.
Until next time, happy renting, and may your journeys be full of both adventure and a feeling of home wherever you go.
You know, that idea of making a temporary space feel like home, it's really stuck with me. It's amazing how we can take a place and make it our own, even if it's not where we'll be forever.
It's like that human need to belong,
Yeah.
to connect,
Yeah.
even when we're somewhere completely new.
Yeah. It's like we find ways to feel comfortable and at home, even in the middle of all that unfamiliarity.
Right, it's about finding ways to ground ourselves and create that sense of comfort even when everything around you is new and different.
I imagine it's about adapting, taking bits and pieces of the new culture and bringing them into your space, like maybe adding local art or fabrics or trying out new recipes from the area.
Exactly. It's about being open to those new experiences and finding ways to make them part of your own story. It's like you're honoring where you come from while also embracing these new and exciting parts of the culture.
And it probably also means letting go a bit too, right? Like not trying to make your temporary home exactly like your old one, but instead accepting and enjoying what's special about this new place.
Absolutely. It's about living in the moment and finding joy in the fact that it's temporary. It reminds you that home isn't just a place. It's a feeling, something you can create wherever you go.
That's such a great way to think about it. And it goes back to what we talked about with those cultural differences. The way people create a sense of home in Chile could be totally different from how they do it in Japan or Italy.
You got it.
Yeah.
The idea of home is really tied to cultural values and traditions. Learning about those differences can be so interesting and open your eyes to new ways of seeing things.
This whole deep dive has been eye-opening for sure. We've gone through Chilean rental laws, those practical tips, and even talked about what home really means. It's amazing how something as ordinary as renting can tell you so much about different places.
It shows that even the everyday stuff can be full of surprises and things to learn if you just stay curious.
Well said. Now, before we finish up our Chilean rental adventure, let's bring it back to those practical tips one last time. They're worth repeating for our listeners.
Definitely. For anyone renting, the important things are to read the contract, carefully pay rent on time, take care of the place, and communicate clearly with the landlord.
And for landlords, remember, documentation is key. Be proactive about maintenance.
Yeah.
And be responsive to your tenants. It's like the formula for a good relationship.
Exactly. And even though the details might change from country to country, those basic principles, respect transparency, open communication, those are universal. They're what make a rental experience work well for everyone.
Now, even though we've covered so much today, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. We've talked about understanding the rules and customs when you're renting somewhere new. But what about the feelings involved? How do you create a sense of home when you're living in a new country just for a while?
That's a really great question. And it's one that makes you think. It's about making that space your own, connecting with the community, and embracing the unique things about this temporary home.
It's about taking that house or apartment and turning it into a place where you feel comfortable and at peace, even though you know you won't be there forever.
Exactly. It's about creating your own little haven, a sanctuary, a place that reflects your personality and where you feel taken care of. And it's also about going beyond just the place itself, getting to know the people and the culture, and maybe even making new connections that add something special to your experience.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And on that note, we'll say goodbye to our listeners for now.
Until next time, happy renting.
Oh.
And may you always find a bit of home wherever your journey takes you.